Welcome, Social Studies 10, to our first read-along. I, Mr. Yang, will be covering pages 139 to 142 in the textbook, so please turn to the section to follow along. But before I get started, I just want to briefly review what we have covered so far in class about the fur trade and its relation to the Metis people. In our readings and on your quiz, we have come to understand that the Metis were a people group raised with elements of both French and henceforth European and First Nations cultures. Therefore, in this read-along, we will reinforce this concept and to help us identify some more elements of the Metis people. For this journal entry, you will write a short response that will be submitted online. The response will be based on this question. Which aspects of Metis life seem to draw on native traditions and which aspects seem more European? Let's begin the reading. The Metis. As NWC traders began pushing deeper into the Northwest in the last decades of the 18th century, they began wintering in their trading areas and staying with local groups of native peoples. As had occurred during the earliest years of the fur trade, a number of fur traders married the daughters of native families. This was encouraged by both the NWC and the native peoples. The NWC thought that such marriages would help ensure trading loyalty, and native elders thought it advantageous to have one or more of the family's daughters marry fur traders. Wives of fur traders enjoyed an improved standard of living, and their lives were generally easier than those of most women. The marriages were important social events. Traders would ask the father of the intended bride for permission to marry, and would pay the young woman's father a sum of money. At the ceremony itself, the bride would be ritually dressed by her family members, and the groom would receive a set of traditional garments. By 1800, some 4,000 voyageurs and Hivernants were living in the Northwest, and many of them had married native women. In contrast to the NWC, the HPC forbade its employees to marry. The company was concerned about supporting too many dependents. In fact, it actually tried to enforce a policy of celibacy among its employees. Isolation in the remote northern environment, however, led to several marriages, including a number of cross-cultural marriages. By the early 19th century, a sizable number of the people living in the Northwest were of European native ancestry. As they began to marry among themselves, a new culture gradually evolved. Later, generations began to think of themselves as a distinct people. Initially, persons of French native ancestry called themselves bois brûlés, literally meaning burnt wood. By about 1810, they began using the term Métis, from the French word for mixed. Because most Europeans in the Northwest were French-Canadian, the Métis formed the largest group of people with mixed ancestry. People with native and Scottish or native and British ancestry preferred the term country-born. The Métis usually spoke French and Algonquin, or a dialect that combined the two languages, and they're usually Roman Catholic. By 1810, a large number of Métis were living near the junction of the Red and Assiniboine rivers in the Red River Valley. Here, they developed communities and a lifestyle that combined both native and European customs. I want to take this moment to ask a bonus question that I would like you to include in your journal entry. If you answer this in your journal entry, you will receive double the points for completing the assignment. Here is the bonus question. In your opinion, what do you think are some of the difficulties of living as a person of two or even more cultures? What do you think might be a positive of living within these multicultures? So take a moment later in your journal entry to answer this bonus question. Now, back to the reading. The Métis lived on some of the best prairie soils, and they built farms along the banks of both rivers. Their farms were laid out in the seigneurial pattern, which had been the long-standing French custom. Like the Plains Indians, the Métis hunted bison, but they were not exclusively dependent on it for survival. The bison hunt developed slowly. By the 1820s, it had become a seasonal event for all Metis. The hunt took place in the early summer and in the autumn, and had several purposes. It not only provided fresh meat and bison hides, but also all the meat and fats that was required to make pemmican. At first, the Metis sold pemmican only to their ally, the NWC. After the merger of the NWC and the HBC in 1821, they also sold pemmican to the new HBC. The bison hunt was a spectacular event that involved the whole community. Metis women, men, and children would set out across the prairie in Red River carts, traveling many days in search of the right herd. The Metis used two types of horses, saddle horses and buffalo runners. The saddle horses pulled the carts until the herd was spotted. Then, the riders would mount the buffalo runners, which were fast, responsive horses that had been trained exclusively to hunt bison. The riders guided the horses by knee pressure, since both hands would be busy loading muzzle loaders with gunpowder and shot, because all the guns until the middle of the 19th century were muzzle loaders. The hunt was extremely dangerous. Guns could explode, horses could trip and fall because of gopher holes, and the pointed horns of the bison could swing unexpectedly. Death and serious injury were not uncommon. Once enough bison had been killed, community members, including the children and the elderly, would help butcher the animals and prepare pemmican. Then the whole hunting party would return to the Red River. During the hunt, the Metis sometimes came into conflict with the Plains Indians, who also hunted bison. However, the strict discipline of the Metis made them formidable opponents. In 1851, a small Metis hunting party was attacked by 1,000 to 2,000 Sioux warriors. For 3 days, 64 Metis fighters held off charge after charge. In the end, the Sioux retreated, vowing never to attack the wagon men, in reference to the Metis' Red River carts ever again. The bison hunt did more for the Metis than simply supply a large amount of meat and clothing. It fostered in them a strong sense of community, pride, and discipline. This would have profound implications for the Metis in the later 19th century. Well, that concludes our read-along. Thank you for listening. Please remember to submit your journal entry online before the start of our next class. And remember, if you have any questions about any assignments or content, feel free to talk to me and I'll be more than happy to have that conversation. Stay classy, Social Studies 10, and best wishes, Mr. Yang.